Hi, my name is Jessica Laster, and I will be discussing the social interaction theory by Lev Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky, otherwise known as the Mozart of psychology, was born on November 5th in 1896 in Belarusia. He was a Russian educator and psychologist during the Russian Revolution in 1917. Vygotsky's work was considered largely unknown to the West until his work was published in 1962. Vygotsky died in 1934 from tuberculosis, and pretty much before a lot of his theories were complete. However, much like the artist, he has given a large impact to today's world. Vygotsky's theory, social interaction, is the belief that social interaction has a fundamental role in child development. It is believed that children are born and meant to interact with other people and their environment. It is through this interaction that children learn and develop their own critical thought. Vygotsky's theory on play. In play, a child always behaves beyond his average age, above his daily behavior. In play, it is though he were a head taller than himself. Lev Vygotsky. What is meant here is that Vygotsky believed that play was a critical component of child development. He believed that during play is when a child was making sense and actually understanding the world around them. This was the time that they were beginning to create their own inner thought and their own inner language based off of what they're seeing around them. He based this on the idea that when children play, they create storylines, they create voices for their toys and dialogue. This is often a result of what they are observing and interacting with on a daily basis and the way they internalize that. So, for example, if you see a child playing with two dolls, and they call one doll the mother doll and the other doll the father doll because they're playing house. You may hear the child say something along the lines of, "See you later, honey, when you get home from work," or "It's time to get the children ready for school," or "Would you like dinner? What would you like for dinner?" These are things that the child typically hears, and they are then transferring that into their playtime, which is its own process of learning in itself. During this time of Lev Vygotsky's developing this theory, there was another man named Jean Piaget who was also developing theory on child development. The two differed in the way that Piaget believed that development preceded learning, where Vygotsky believed that learning preceded development. Piaget believed that learning took place in stages. Repetition aided understanding, which makes me think of the traditional classrooms where, for example, if a teacher wants the child to learn vocabulary, they would give them a list of words, and the child would have to constantly write them and say them over in order to remember them. Vygotsky, on the other hand, believes that children learn best through interaction with people and the environment. He believes that children also learn best when learning is a give and take relationship, that all parties involved are benefiting from the learning process, and that the child is being an active component in that process. There are three major components of social interaction theory. The first is, as I stated, the belief that social interaction creates learning rather than the idea that learning precedes social development. In order for learning to occur, it is believed that there has to be an individual that is more knowledgeable than the learner. This individual is considered the MKO. Lastly, the zone of proximal development is a key component to Vygotsky's theory. It is the belief that learning will occur best when the task is just outside the reach of what the learner can do on their own. Human beings are the only species who developed a culture. When we come into the world with knowledge, we come into a world with knowledge, And when we do, we begin to be active participants in our learning experience with our environments and older humans. Vygotsky believed that learning and knowledge happened based on the following. As children, we communicate meaninglessly and we refer to objects. For example, a child pointing their finger at something or grabbing for something. Adults or objects in our environment respond to our communication with a reaction or words, and that then gives our action meaning. So, for example, if a child points to a toy and the parent gives the child the toy, now the child connects pointing their finger to a meaning, that it indicates that they get something that they want. Through this process, the child begins to connect these experiences and these thoughts through learning, and they develop their own inner thought and language. And as they build those cognitive thoughts, they begin to learn how to express themselves clearly. Children, as I said, learn when there's someone interacting with them who is more knowledgeable in the subject. We often think that this individual has to be the parent or teacher or adult, but often it is peers as well. You can think of peer tutoring. Peer tutoring occurs when there is one child that may be a little bit more advanced in that particular area or subject than another child. And the child who is not as proficient is able to learn from their peer. This is the component where they hone in on the idea that the child is an active participant. They are not a bank that is being deposited information, whereas they are actually engaging with the learning process. The zone of proximal development is reflected in the diagram shown to you. There is current understanding where the child understands what they are supposed to do and they can do it on their own. Then there is the zone of proximal development where Vygotsky believed true learning occurred. This is when the child has some understanding, but they struggle a bit. They need coaching, they need prompting, they need scaffolding. And then you have what is out of the reach of the child. It is believed that no matter what coaching takes place, the child will not truly be successful and learn to their fullest capability if they are trying to access things, or the teachers trying to have them access things that are out of the reach of their ability. However, in the zone of proximal development is where the learning takes place. That is where that interaction takes place between the learner and the instructor, and that is when the child grows the most. For example, we see a father, or presumably father, who is helping their son learn how to ride a bike. And the son is in joy because he's actually figuring it out. We can assume in this scenario that the child at first had training wheels, and the child was completely capable of turning the wheels in order for the bike to move. That was their understanding, and with the training wheels, they were capable of doing it on their own. When the training wheels were removed, the child was not capable of having their balance on their own. The adult had to give the child support, guidance, and coaching in order for the child to gain their balance. After a few blocks or a little bit of practice, the child begins to no longer need the adult, because the child will eventually become proficient and can ride the bike on its own. That is essentially the process of the zone of proximal development. That moment where the adult is coaching the child to a point of proficiency. Vygotsky had a huge impact on education, particularly in three major aspects: curriculum, instruction, and assessment. Current curriculum is developed with the expectation that students are bringing prior knowledge to the subject, while also building on that knowledge and requiring students to do things that require teacher guidance. Many curriculums also incorporate the gradual release, which is associated with the zone of proximal development. With instruction, the zone of proximal development directly applies to how a lot of classrooms, a lot of schools, and a lot of districts have their teachers deliver instruction. We often incorporate the gradual release method. We may not, depending on where you work, it may not be called this per se, but the method is typically the same, where the teacher models the skill, the students then practice the skill with the teacher, and as the student's performance improves, the teacher begins to allow more independent work, and eventually the child will become proficient. So as a 7th grade reading teacher, when I first taught my children characterization, I modeled it for them in a book. I modeled how to read fluently. I modeled how to describe the character. I modeled how to connect that to personality traits. I modeled my thinking. And then I gave my children opportunity to read and to practice the skill. But I didn't just leave them on their own. I went around and I coached and I guided them through the process. We worked on examples together. I pulled small groups. I let them work in groups. The more they practiced, the better they became, and I eventually allowed them to do more independent work. And now we are getting to the point where the children are basically able to handle that skill by themselves without me. Assessment also begins to reflect Vygotsky's theory, because assessments are supposed to keep in mind that zone of proximal development. They don't want the assessments to be too easy where the child can do it without any instruction, without having been taught the skills prior to. But they also don't want to make the assessments too hard so that the child is not able to achieve it at all. Assessments are typically made with the understanding that through the zone of proximal development, the child has gotten enough guidance to be able to do the assessment on their own. Assessments also can be reflective of Vygotsky's theory because although Vygotsky never used the word scaffolding, you can scaffold within an assessment through various question stems or how the question is being asked. Before we conclude, I would really like to leave the class with a few questions to think about. If many of our schools are modeling after Vygotsky's theory, again, we see it with the gradual release process and the belief that children need to be guided through their learning. And also if we understand that children learn best from their environment and interactions with others, I'm curious about how you all think state tests align with that. Do you think the state tests that we have to take at the end of the year, are they contradictory of this idea, of this theory? Also, if children rely on scaffolding and a more knowledgeable other to be successful and learn, what happens when children interact with less effective teachers? And lastly, how does culturally responsive teaching align with Vygotsky's theory? Vygotsky has had a major impact on our world. It has had a major impact on the world of education specifically, and I personally see it throughout my own teaching experience. Thank you.